This is the moment most people misunderstand, so let me say it plainly. What you just lived through was not a breakup. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not timing. It was God issuing a separation order in the Spirit, because the season of mercy as covering has ended, and the season of judgment as alignment has begun. You did not stumble out of that connection by accident. You were removed by a hand you could not see, but have felt your entire life when truth becomes unavoidable. And if you have been wondering why it happened with such finality, why the door closed with such precision, why the thread snapped in a way that made you say, "This is different, this is permanent," it is because it was not merely emotional, it was judicial. And when God separates, He does not separate as a suggestion. He separates as a verdict, and that verdict carries consequences for the one who abused access to your life. That is what "it's showtime" truly means in this context. Not entertainment, exposure, not spectacle, revealing, not drama, divine intervention. Because there comes a point when God stops allowing a person to hide behind charm, appearance, excuses, or spiritual language, and begins to let the harvest speak for itself. And the moment God separated you from a narcissist, the clock did not start ticking. The clock stopped for them. The era of, "I can still fix this, I can still return, I can still reach them," ended. And what follows is not a single bad day, not a quick hit of regret, not a passing sadness. What follows is something far more severe, a form of punishment that feels eternal, not because God is cruel, but because the consequences are structured to teach what pride refused to learn. This is why the separation felt like a line being drawn. You didn't just walk away. You crossed a threshold, one that moves us directly into the second pillar. God separated you, and that separation is the mechanism through which judgment begins. God did not separate you because you were tired. He did not separate you because emotions ran high. He did not separate you because the relationship simply didn't work out. God separated you because access was abused, truth was violated repeatedly, and what was meant to be sacred was treated as expendable. For many believers, especially those who have walked with God for decades, this is one of the hardest realities to accept. Separation is not always loss. Very often, separation is judgment disguised as protection. It is the moment when God intervenes not to rescue the other person from consequence, but to rescue you from further damage. A narcissist does not merely relate to people they consume access to your empathy, access to your forgiveness, access to your patience, access to your faith. Over time, that access becomes something they feel entitled to, something they believe they can violate without limit because you are understanding, godly, or slow to anger. But Scripture is clear. Grace that is persistently exploited is not infinite in application. There comes a point when grace stops shielding and truth steps forward. That is where you were standing when the separation happened. God did not ask you to keep enduring what was quietly dismantling your peace. He did not call you to remain where your spirit was being eroded under the guise of love, duty, or reconciliation. He separated you because remaining would have required you to betray your own conscience, and God does not ask His people to sacrifice discernment in the name of loyalty. This is why the separation felt abrupt, decisive, and strangely calm all at once. There was grief, yes, but beneath the grief was clarity, a sense that something irreversible had taken place. Not dramatic, not explosive, final. When God separates, He does not leave the door unlocked as an option for later negotiation. He closes it because what crossed the boundary cannot be undone with words. For the narcissist, this is deeply disorienting. They interpret separation as a tactic, a phase that can be managed, waited out, or reversed with the right performance. Apologies become tools. Regret becomes strategic. Even spiritual language may appear, not as repentance, but as an attempt to regain moral leverage. But what they are encountering now is not your resolve, it is God's restraint placed between you and them. And that restraint feels unbearable to someone who has survived by control. This is where the panic begins. Not because they suddenly understand love, but because they understand loss of access. You are no longer reachable in the ways that once sustained their sense of power. Your silence is not submission. Your absence is not weakness. It is the evidence that something higher has intervened. If you are listening to this and something in you quietly says, "Yes, this is exactly how it felt," I want you to pause for a moment and acknowledge it. You don't need to explain it to anyone. You don't need to justify it. Just type 77 as a way of saying, "I recognize this separation was not random." Naming truth matters when you have spent years being told to doubt your own discernment. Because here is what must be understood. God separated you not only to end what was harming you, but to begin what He could not build while you were still entangled. Peace cannot grow in a climate of manipulation. Restoration cannot take root where confusion is constantly reintroduced. Separation clears the ground. And once the ground is cleared, something else begins to surface. Not immediately, not publicly, but inwardly and relentlessly. The narcissist begins to feel what it is like to stand alone, without the stabilizing presence they took for granted, without the emotional mirror, without the spiritual buffer, without the person who absorbed the chaos and kept the system running. That is when separation turns from shock into weight, from confusion into realization, and from realization into the slow awareness that what was lost was not temporary, it was structural. Because God does not separate lightly, and He does not separate without purpose. What follows separation is not reconciliation, it is reckoning. And as access disappears, another force quietly takes its place. Memory, longing, regret, and the dawning recognition that something irreplaceable has slipped permanently out of reach, where loss begins to speak louder than denial ever could. Something shifts after separation, and it does not arrive with noise. It comes quietly, in the hours when control once operated effortlessly and now receives no response. Once God has removed you, the narcissist does not immediately grasp what has occurred. At first they assume the distance is temporary. They believe silence is simply another phase in a familiar cycle. They tell themselves, "You will calm down," that time will soften you, that patterns will resume, because patterns are how they survive. Patterns reassure them that nothing is truly lost. But then something unsettling begins to surface. Your absence feels different this time, not reactive, not charged, not emotional. It carries a stillness they cannot penetrate. And stillness is deeply threatening to a personality built on influence, feedback, and leverage. When there is no reaction to manage, no energy to pull, no access point to exploit, an internal panic begins to rise, one that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with loss of control. This is when the searching begins. Not physically at first, but internally, in memory, in imagination, in dreams. Narcissistic attachment relies heavily on mental access. On the surface, they may appear detached, even boastful, as though they have moved on effortlessly. But beneath that performance, the mind keeps circling back, not because the heart has softened, but because the structure that once stabilized their sense of self has been removed. You were not simply a partner or a presence. You were an anchor. You absorbed tension. You normalized dysfunction. You translated chaos into coherence. And once that role disappears, the system begins to wobble. This is why the searching intensifies at night, when distractions fall away, when there is no audience, when the mind is left alone with itself. Thoughts surface, uninvited. Scenes replay. Words return. They wonder where you are, what you are doing, whether you think of them, whether you have truly moved on, and the more they think, the more unsettled they become. Some experience vivid dreams, not romantic dreams, but restless ones. Dreams of trying to find you, trying to speak, trying to explain, trying to undo what cannot be undone. Others feel a constant mental pull, as though you are always just out of reach. This is not intuition, it is withdrawal. What they are experiencing is the collapse of an illusion, the belief that you would always be there, always return, always forgive, always reopen the door. When God removes someone from a narcissist's reach, the removal is not only physical or relational, it is energetic. The old channels no longer respond, the familiar hooks no longer catch, and the absence begins to speak. They may attempt to re-establish connection indirectly, monitoring your life from a distance, replaying your words, revisiting places associated with you, imagining encounters that never occur. But every attempt ends the same way, with the realization that something essential has changed. You are no longer positioned beneath them, you are no longer oriented toward them, and you are no longer available to carry what they refuse to face in themselves. This is where awareness takes shape, slow, uncomfortable, and unavoidable. Not repentance, but consequence. The understanding that they did not simply lose a relationship, but a stabilizing force they assumed would never leave. The mind finally accepts what the ego resisted for so long. The loss is real, and it is irreversible. The searching offers no relief. It deepens the ache. Each memory becomes a reminder of what cannot be reclaimed. Each attempt to reach back highlights the finality of the separation. Silence grows heavier than confrontation ever was. And as they continue to look for you in places where you no longer exist, a deeper truth emerges. The emptiness they feel is not caused by your absence alone, but by the sudden exposure of what was always missing within them. That realization does not bring peace. It transforms loss from a passing emotion into a lasting condition, one that quietly reshapes their inner world, as the weight of what cannot be retrieved settles in and refuses to lift. Eternal punishment when realization comes too late to change anything. Eternal punishment is often misunderstood. People imagine fire, collapse, dramatic ruin. But the kind of punishment that follows divine separation is far more precise and far more enduring. It is not about what happens to them. It is about what they must live with. Eternal punishment begins at the moment realization arrives after opportunity has expired. When the narcissist finally sees clearly, not through denial, not through distortion, not through self-justifying stories, but through the unfiltered truth that what they lost cannot be replaced, repaired, or recovered. Not because you are unreachable, but because the moment that allowed restoration has passed. This is the punishment of late awakening. They see at last what you were, not as an accessory, not as a convenience, not as someone who would always absorb the damage. They see that you were a stabilizing force, a moral anchor, a source of sincerity they treated as ordinary because it was always there. And the weight of that realization does not strike once. It strikes repeatedly, quietly, relentlessly, because there is no relief in understanding without remedy. They begin to replay the moments they dismissed, the warnings they ignored, the chances they wasted, the times you stayed when leaving would have been easier, the patience you offered when accountability was required, and the mind keeps returning to the same conclusion. This did not have to end this way, yet it did. That is why this punishment feels eternal. Not because it is loud, but because it is persistent. It follows them into ordinary days, into calm moments, into successes that no longer satisfy, into relationships that feel shallow by comparison. Every new situation is silently measured against what they lost, and every comparison falls short. They may attempt to convince themselves they have moved on, they may appear functional, they may even prosper outwardly, but internally the knowing does not fade. The awareness that they forfeited something irreplaceable becomes part of their mental landscape. It settles into the background of thought, shaping how they experience everything that comes after. This is not shame imposed from the outside. It is conscience activated from within. And unlike external punishment, conscience does not grant escape, it does not negotiate, it does not forget. It revisits the same truth at unexpected moments when the mind is unguarded, when distraction fails, when silence returns. The truth rises without warning. You had it, you mishandled it, and now it is gone. That truth becomes heavier over time, not lighter, because as years pass, it becomes increasingly clear that no new beginning can undo that loss. No replacement can recreate the exact combination of trust, depth, patience, and moral presence you embodied. The older they grow, the more final the loss feels. This is where eternal punishment separates itself from temporary regret. Regret hopes for reversal. Eternal punishment knows reversal is impossible. Regret looks forward to fixing things. Eternal punishment looks back, fully aware that fixing is no longer an option. And what makes this judgment especially severe is that no one is attacking them. No one is reminding them. No one is forcing them to remember. The memory surfaces on its own because it is attached to truth. And truth does not require maintenance to remain alive. They live with the knowledge that they were entrusted with something rare and treated it casually, that they were given access to a person who loved with integrity and responded with manipulation, that they confused patience for weakness and mercy for entitlement, and once that confusion is exposed, it cannot be unlearned. This is why eternal punishment is not about suffering inflicted by God in anger. It is about consequence allowed by God in justice. A life structured in such a way that the lesson cannot be escaped, bypassed, or outsourced to someone else. They are left to carry it not dramatically, not publicly, but continuously. And as that weight settles into their inner world, it begins to shape their future in subtle ways. Choices become defensive, connections remain shallow, and satisfaction feels incomplete. Because eternal punishment is not the destruction of life. It is the inability to return to the life that could have been. And as this awareness deepens, another image begins to form, not as metaphor, but as lived experience. The sense of effort without resolution, of striving without arrival, of repeating the same internal labor without ever reaching peace. A cycle that renews itself each day, carrying them into a condition where the punishment is no longer an event, but a pattern, one that continues to unfold, quietly and without end. The boulder that never stays at the top when life becomes a repeating sentence. There is a form of judgment that does not announce itself with catastrophe. It settles in slowly, shaping the rhythm of a person's days until life itself becomes the punishment. This is where the image begins to take form not as mythology, not as poetry, but as lived experience. The endless pushing, the brief illusion of progress, the inevitable collapse, and the quiet command to begin again. Like the soul condemned to push a boulder uphill only to watch it roll back down, the narcissist finds themselves locked into a cycle they cannot explain but cannot escape. Each day begins with effort. Each season carries the hope that this time will be different. And each attempt ends the same way, with the weight returning, heavier than before. They strive for validation, but it never lasts. They chase admiration, but it evaporates quickly. They build stories about themselves, only to feel them unravel in moments of stillness. What makes this punishment so precise is that it mirrors how they lived with you. They demanded constant reassurance, but never felt secure. They required endless patience, but never learned restraint. They insisted on control, but never found peace. Now that same imbalance defines their inner world. They may succeed outwardly, they may appear functional, but inwardly there is no rest. Satisfaction slips through their fingers. Joy feels temporary. Achievement feels hollow. Each milestone brings a momentary lift, followed by a familiar drop, the realization that something essential is still missing. And so they push again. Another relationship. Another persona. Another attempt to feel whole without facing truth. But the boulder always rolls back. Because the weight they are carrying is not circumstance, it is unresolved self-awareness. It is the quiet knowledge that what they are trying to escape is not outside of them, it is within. And no amount of effort can lift a burden that was meant to be laid down through humility rather than force. This is where many misunderstand divine justice. They assume punishment must be dramatic to be real. But God often chooses repetition over spectacle, because repetition teaches what resistance refuses to learn. Each time the narcissist begins again, they do so with the faint memory of what life felt like when you were there, when things were steadier, when the chaos was absorbed, when the boulder felt lighter because someone else was helping carry the load, and that memory becomes part of the weight. Not sharp enough to destroy them, not dull enough to disappear, just heavy enough to endure. They wake up each morning with the sense that they are always starting over, always rebuilding, always explaining themselves, always trying to outrun something unnamed. And no matter how far they go, the same exhaustion returns, the same dissatisfaction, the same inner strain. This is not coincidence. It is structure. A life arranged so that effort never equals fulfillment, so that motion never produces peace, so that striving replaces rest, because rest would require honesty, and honesty would require admitting that the loss of you was not bad luck, not misunderstanding, not fate, but consequence. The most severe part of this punishment is not the labor itself, it is the clarity that comes with it. The awareness that no matter how many times they push, the outcome will not change until the lesson is learned, and the lesson cannot be learned without surrender. But surrender is what they have avoided all along. So the cycle continues, not as cruelty, not as revenge, but as alignment. And while they repeat the same inner labor day after day, something else becomes increasingly clear. This punishment has no visible end because it was never designed to be escaped through effort alone. It was designed to expose the futility of control when control has replaced conscience. And as that realization deepens, the boulder remains. The hill remains. The labor remains. Not as drama, but as destiny shaped by choice, quietly pressing forward, defining each step, and revealing, again and again, that some losses are not meant to be overcome, only understood. No one punishes them. Your memory becomes the sentence they carry. There is a point in divine judgment where punishment no longer needs an external source. No confrontation, no exposure. No voice raised in accusation, because the most enduring judgment is the one that lives inside a person and answers to no one but truth. This is where the narcissist arrives after the cycles have repeated long enough, after the boulder has rolled back down too many times, after distraction has lost its power. They come to understand something they never planned to face. No one is chasing them, no one is attacking them, no one is trying to make them suffer, and yet the weight does not lift. That is because you are no longer part of the equation, but the memory of you remains. Not as nostalgia, not as longing in the romantic sense, but as a permanent reference point. You become the silent comparison that no new situation can erase, the measure against which every connection feels thinner, the reminder of a depth they once stood in without understanding its value. And that memory does not argue, it does not accuse, it simply exists unmovable because it is anchored in reality. This is what makes it unbearable. They remember how you showed up when things were difficult, how you stayed present when avoidance would have been easier, how you carried yourself with integrity even when you were hurt, how you did not need to dominate to be strong. And they remember how they responded, not in one dramatic moment, but in patterns: dismissal, manipulation, entitlement, silence when accountability was required. Those memories surface without warning, in the middle of ordinary days, in moments that should feel peaceful, when there is nothing to defend against and nowhere to project blame. And because there is no one left to absorb the discomfort turns inward. This is where conscience finally speaks clearly, not as shame imposed by others, but as an internal reckoning that cannot be negotiated. The mind begins to replay what the heart once minimized. And unlike external criticism, this inner witness cannot be silenced with charm, denial, or justification. It does not escalate, it does not shout, it simply waits. Patient, accurate, persistent. They may try to outrun it by filling their life with noise, new relationships, new goals, new identities. But the memory travels with them because it is not attached to circumstance, it is attached to understanding, and understanding, once formed, does not dissolve. This is why even success feels incomplete, even admiration feels hollow, even connection feels conditional, because something essential is missing and they know exactly when it disappeared. Not when you left, but when they crossed the line that made your leaving inevitable. That realization becomes the sentence. They carry it into every interaction, into every attempt to be seen, into every effort to feel significant. And the punishment is not pain alone, it is clarity without remedy, the knowledge that the person they harmed was not replaceable, that the opportunity they squandered was singular, that the version of life that included you can no longer be revisited, no matter how much time passes. This is why no one needs to punish them. God allows memory to do what confrontation never could. He allows truth to stand where argument once failed. He allows silence to teach where noise was ignored. And the more they mature in years, the heavier that memory becomes, not because it grows more dramatic, but because it grows more settled. It becomes part of how they understand themselves, part of how they interpret loss, part of how they experience the world. A quiet, unrelenting awareness that they once stood before something real, treated it lightly, and now must live with the absence of what can never be restored. That is the judgment that does not fade. That is the sentence that requires no guard. And it remains, steady and undeniable, shaping every step forward without ever needing to announce itself. This is the difference divine judgment creates. One life is forced inward to carry what it refused to face. The other is gently guided forward, no longer entangled in a burden that was never meant to be carried alone. You are not elevated above them, you are freed from them. and that freedom becomes the quiet evidence that God did not separate to destroy, but to restore order.